She touched the cursed prince during a blood moon ritual. The entire graveyard went silent. What she didn't realize, she'd just committed treason punishable by death, and the vampire king watching from the shadows would have to choose between his throne and his only son. The fog moved through the cemetery like something alive, curling around tombstones worn smooth by centuries of rain. Katie Harrow's knees ached as she knelt before her husband's grave, the damp earth seeping through her threadbare mourning dress. 23 years he'd been gone. 23 years of visiting this same plot, placing the same wildflowers, whispering the same prayers. Wait. Before the story gets even crazier, smash that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what part of the story has you locked in. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. She was just reaching to straighten the crooked wooden cross when she heard it. A sound so soft she almost mistook it for wind through the crypts. A hitched breath. A trembling exhale that spoke of terror barely contained. Katie's weathered hands froze. No one comes to the old graveyard during blood moon nights. Everyone in the kingdom knew that. The red-stained moon overhead was sacred to the vampire court, a night when the old rituals were observed and humans locked their doors and prayed to gods who'd stopped listening decades ago. She should leave. Now. Before whatever nightmare the vampires were conducting in the darkness noticed her. But that sound came again. Smaller this time. A child's broken whimper. Katie's body moved before her mind could stop it, her survival instinct screaming as she pushed aside the hanging moss and rounded a marble mausoleum. There, among the tilted grave markers where the oldest dead lay buried, sat a small figure. The boy couldn't have been older than 6. His pale hair caught the crimson moonlight like spun silver, and he wore a white nightshirt so fine it could only belong to nobility, now dirt-stained and torn at the hem. His thin arms wrapped around his knees, and he rocked slightly, silently, back and forth. But it was his eyes that made Katie's breath catch. Milky white, unfocused, staring at nothing. Blind. And burned into the collar of his nightshirt, barely visible in the moon's glow, was a crest Katie recognized from every coin, every banner, every proclamation read in the town square. The royal seal of House Draven. The vampire king's son. Katie's heart slammed against her ribs. They left him here. They actually left a child. She knew the stories. Everyone did. Whispered in corners, never spoken aloud where vampire ears might hear. The old laws said any airborne imperfect must be returned to the earth before dawn, left in consecrated ground to die as the gods intended. To interfere with the ritual was to spit on vampire sacred law. To touch a royal vampire without permission was death. The smart thing, the only thing, was to turn around. Pretend she'd seen nothing. Go home to her cottage and thank whatever mercies still existed that she'd survived another night in this cursed kingdom. The boy's head turned slightly toward the sound of her breathing. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, hoarse from crying. "Is someone there?" Katie stood frozen, her worn boots sinking into the muddy earth. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at her to run. She was 58 years old. Human. Powerless. One word to the wrong vampire, and she'd be dead before sunrise. The child reached out one small, trembling hand toward where her breathing had come from. "Please," he whispered, and his voice cracked on the word. "Please don't leave me in the dark. I don't want to be alone when it gets colder." Something inside Katie's chest, something that had calcified 20 years ago when vampire soldiers took her own son and never brought him back, cracked clean through. Damn them. Damn them all to whatever hell takes monsters. She crossed the distance in 4 steps, her knees protesting as she knelt in the mud beside him. The boy flinched at the sound but didn't pull away. Up close, she could see he was shaking violently, his lips tinged blue from cold despite the late summer night. "Hush now," Katie heard herself say, her voice rusty from disuse. She unwrapped the only shawl she owned, black wool, patched a dozen times, but warm, and draped it around the child's narrow shoulders. "I've got you." The boy's blind eyes went wide, his small hands clutching at the fabric like it was a lifeline. You're not supposed to touch me," he whispered, but even as he said it, he leaned into her warmth. "The priestess said I'm cursed. That the gods marked me broken. That I have to stay here until the sun comes and makes me clean again." Katie's jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached. The only thing broken here is any god that would ask this of a child. She looked around the graveyard, scanning the shadows between crypts, the dark spaces beneath ancient trees. Where are the guards? The priestesses who would have brought him? They'd be watching, waiting to ensure the ritual was completed. And if they saw her. The boy's small hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers ice-cold and fragile as bird bones. "My name is Sean," he said softly, as if offering her something precious. "What's yours?" Katie stared down at their joined hands, gnarled, liver-spotted skin against smooth, pale fingers. "Human and vampire. Forbidden. Treasonous." "Katie," she whispered back. And then, because there was no going back now, because she'd already signed both their death warrants the moment she'd wrapped him in her shawl, "Hold on tight, Sean. We're going home." She gathered the boy into her arms, feeling how light he was, how little he weighed, as if the vampire court had been starving him along with everything else. Sean buried his face against her shoulder, his body still trembling, but his grip fierce now, desperate. Katie stood, her back protesting, her heart hammering against her ribs. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The blood moon watched from above, unblinking and merciless. If they're watching, they've already seen. If they come for us, we're already dead. So she walked. Out of the graveyard of the abandoned dead, through the fog that parted before her like a curtain, carrying a prince no one wanted and a treason she'd commit again without hesitation. Behind them, hidden in the shadow of the largest crypt, a figure stood perfectly still. King Melvin Draven watched the human woman disappear into the mist with his son cradled in her arms like something worth saving. His hand gripped the stone so hard it cracked beneath his fingers. For 3 hours, he'd stood in this graveyard, listening to his son's quiet sobs, every instinct in his ancient body screaming at him to go to the child. For 3 hours, the council's words had echoed in his skull. "Weakness, Your Majesty. Sentiment. A blind heir will destroy everything we've built." He'd told himself he was doing the right thing. The necessary thing. Now he watched the old woman's retreating back, saw how carefully she held Sean, how she'd given the boy her only shawl without hesitation. Something cold and long dormant stirred in Melvin's chest. "Find them," he said softly, and 4 vampire guards materialized from the shadows around him. "The human woman who just left with my son. I want her name, her home, everything." The captain of the guard hesitated. "Shall we retrieve the prince, Your Majesty?" Melvin stood silent for a long moment, his eyes still fixed on the place where they'd vanished into the fog. When he spoke, his voice was carefully empty. "Not yet. I want to see what she does with him." The guards melted back into shadow, and King Melvin was alone in the graveyard of his ancestors, surrounded by the dead who'd built his kingdom on laws he'd never questioned. Until tonight. Until a widow with nothing had done what he, king, warrior, immortal, had been too afraid to do. The blood moon began to sink toward the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, in a cottage he would soon find, his son was being carried toward something his father had failed to give him. Warmth. Safety. Worth. And when dawn came, Melvin thought there would be a reckoning. The only question was which way his blade would fall. Hold up. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Hit like and comment your country or city and what you're enjoying most about the story so far. I'm reading every single one. Chapter 1. Katie's cottage smelled of dried herbs and old wood smoke, the fire in the hearth barely more than embers when she kicked the door shut behind her. Shawn hadn't spoken since the graveyard, his small body curled against her chest like he was trying to disappear into her bones. She set him down gently on the stool near the fireplace, her arms aching from the walk. The boy's milky eyes tracked toward the sound of her movements, his head tilting with each creak of floorboard, each pop of settling wood. Listening to a world he'd never see. Katie hung her damp shawl on its peg and pumped water into the chipped wash basin, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind screamed at her. "What have you done? What have you done?" She dampened a cloth and knelt before Shawn, dabbing gently at the dirt streaked across his pale cheeks. He flinched at the first touch, then held perfectly still, as if he'd learned long ago that stillness was survival. "Easy," Katie murmured. "Just getting you clean, little one." As she wiped away the grime, something caught the firelight. There, burned into the collar of his nightshirt, not embroidered, but seared directly into the fabric and the skin beneath, was the royal crest. The dragon and crown of House Draven, marked on him like cattle. Katie's hand froze. Her chest tightened until she couldn't breathe. The king's son. The actual heir to the throne. She should take him back. Right now. Carry him to the palace gates, claim she'd found him wandering, plead ignorance of the ritual. Maybe they'd show mercy. Maybe they'd only kill her instead of both of them. Shawn's small hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers wrapping around her thumb with desperate strength. "You smell like bread and safety," he whispered, and his voice cracked on the last word. "Everyone else smells like fear and disappointment. But you smell like my mama did. Before." Katie's eyes burned. She stared down at this broken little prince, at his blind eyes and his branded collar and his trembling mouth, and something in her chest that had been dead for 20 years roared back to life. "Then bread is what you'll have," she said roughly, standing before her knees could betray her. "And safety, for as long as I can give it." She pulled the spare blanket from her bed, thin, patched, but clean, and wrapped it around his shoulders. Shawn clutched it like treasure. 15 miles away, in the obsidian throne room of Castle Draven, King Melvin paced. His boots echoed on black marble worn smooth by 5 centuries of rulers. Empty wine goblets littered the long table, 3, 5, 8 of them, their contents drained and providing no relief. The torches guttered in their sconces, casting his shadow long and monstrous across the floor. "You did what was necessary," he told himself for the 100th time. The council demanded it. The old laws are absolute. A blind heir would be seen as weakness, and weakness invites war. He'd told himself the same thing 3 hours ago when he'd carried his sleeping son to the graveyard. Had repeated it like a prayer when Shawn had woken in his arms, confused and frightened. Had whispered it when he'd laid the boy among the tombstones and walked away from those pleading, unseeing eyes. The right thing. The necessary thing. Melvin's fist slammed into the stone wall, and the impact cracked it like lightning. Blood welled from his knuckles, black in the torchlight, and healed before it could drip. "Your Majesty." Captain Thorne materialized from the shadows, his expression carefully blank. "We've located the woman. Katie Harrow, 58, widow, human. She lives alone in the eastern quarter. And the prince." He hesitated. "The prince is with her." Melvin turned slowly, his eyes burning crimson in the darkness. "She still has him." "Yes, sire. She took him into her home an hour ago. Our scouts report, she's fed him, given him blankets." The king stood perfectly still. Outside the windows, the blood moon finally touched the horizon, its red light fading to gray dawn. "Assemble the guard," Melvin said quietly. "At sunset, we retrieve my son. And execute the thief who'd stolen him, though he didn't say it aloud." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Chapter 2. Shawn woke to the sound of bells. Soft, silvery chimes that rang with each movement of air through the cottage. He sat up slowly, disoriented, his hands finding the rough wool blanket Katie had wrapped around him. The texture was nothing like the silk sheets in his father's castle. It was coarser, warmer, real in a way that made his chest ache. "Good morning, little prince." Katie's voice came from across the room, accompanied by the crackle of fire and the smell of something baking. "I've made some changes while you slept. Come find me." Sean's breath caught. At the castle, servants had carried him everywhere, their hands tied on his arms like he was a porcelain doll that might shatter. No one had ever asked him to move on his own. He slid off the stool carefully, his bare feet finding the cold wooden floor. As he took a tentative step, bells chimed to his left. He turned toward them, hands outstretched, and found a doorframe. More bells hung there, 3 of them on a string, each with a different tone. "The bells tell you where the openings are," Katie called. "Front door has 3. Bedroom has 2. Window has 1. Listen, and you'll always know where you're going." Sean moved slowly through the cottage, his fingers trailing along walls that felt like sun-warmed stone, rough and solid. Each doorway announced itself with music. By the time he reached the hearth, following the heat and the scent of bread, he was smiling. Katie guided his hand to the back of a chair. "Now, let me teach you about colors. You've heard the words, yes? Red, blue, green. They don't mean anything," Sean admitted quietly. "Just sounds people use to describe things I can't understand. Then we'll give them new meanings." Katie took his hand and held it near the fire, not close enough to burn, but close enough to feel the radiating heat. "Red is this. Warmth that pulses and dances. It crackles and pops. Red is hot fire and your heartbeat when you run." She moved his hand to the wash basin, letting his fingers trail through the cool water. "Blue is this. Smooth and flowing, like silk made of winter mornings. Blue is the sound of rain on the roof, gentle and constant." Sean's fingers explored the water, his face transformed with wonder. "And green. Green is soft and alive. Like the herbs in my garden here, feel." She pressed a sprig of rosemary into his palm. "Green whispers when the wind blows. It smells like growing things and tastes like spring." For an hour, Katie walked him through her small world, renaming everything in a language his hands and ears could speak. Then she brought him to the table where dough waited in a wooden bowl. "Knead this," she said, guiding his hands into the soft, yielding mass. "Feel how it pushes back? How it's sticky but becomes smooth when you work it. This teaches your fingers about space and resistance. About how much pressure changes things." Sean pressed into the dough, his small hands clumsy at first, then finding a rhythm. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. The repetitive motion was soothing, meditative. He could feel the dough transforming under his touch, becoming elastic and alive. "I'm making something," he breathed, coloring his voice. "I'm actually making something." "You're making bread," Katie said softly. "Tomorrow, you'll eat what your own hands created." Sean kneaded faster, his face flushed with concentration and something Katie hadn't seen since she'd found him, joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Then his hands slipped in the dough, making a squelching sound that echoed through the quiet cottage. Sean froze. Then, slowly, a smile tugged at his mouth. He squeezed the dough deliberately, making the sound again. And again. Quick pause. If this story has you hooked, tap subscribe and drop a like. Then tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what moment grabbed you the most. Your comments help keep the story alive. A giggle bubbled up from his chest, tentative at first, then growing stronger. He laughed, the sound bright and clear as bells, his whole body shaking with it. Katie's vision blurred. She pressed a weathered hand to her mouth, watching this blind little prince discover the simple absurdity of sticky dough and silly sounds. 20 years ago, her own son had laughed just like that, before the vampire soldiers came. "What's wrong?" Sean asked, his laughter fading, his face turning toward her with uncanny precision. "You're crying. Did I do something bad?" "No, sweetheart." Katie's voice cracked. "You did something perfect." She pulled him close, this child who wasn't hers, this prince she'd condemned them both to save, and let herself weep into his silver hair while he clutched her dress with dough-covered hands and laughed again, because he finally could. Chapter 3. Melvin hadn't slept in 36 hours. He told himself vampires didn't need sleep the way humans did, that he'd gone decades without rest during the Blood Wars. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the graveyard. Saw his son's small figure among the tombstones, trembling in the cold. Saw himself walking away. Send the blood trackers, he ordered Captain Thorne at midnight of the second day. I want confirmation that the ritual was completed. Thorne's expression remained carefully neutral, but his hesitation spoke volumes. The ritual, Your Majesty? Or the boy? Melvin's fingers tightened on the arm of his throne, the black marble cracking under his grip. Both. But alone in his chambers an hour later, waiting for the trackers to report, Melvin couldn't maintain the lie. He pressed his palms against the cold window glass, staring out at the blood moon's fading light, and let himself remember. Promise me you'll love him even if he can't see you. Ilara's voice, weak from blood loss, her hand clutching his as their son wailed in the midwife's arms. She'd known. Somehow, in those final moments, she'd known what the child's milky eyes meant, what the council would demand. Promise me, Melvin. He'd promised. Held her hand as the light faded from her eyes, their newborn son crying in the background, and he'd sworn on everything he had left that he would love the boy regardless. For 6 years, he'd kept that promise. Had held Sean when he cried, read him stories the boy couldn't see, taught him to recognize voices and footsteps. Had watched his son learn to navigate the castle through sound and touch, marveling at the intelligence that shone through despite, perhaps because of, his blindness. Then the council had convened. High Priestess Morana had presented the old laws, her voice dripping with ancient authority. A king must be perfect. An heir with defects weakens the bloodline. The gods demand purity. Melvin had argued. For 3 days and nights, he'd fought them. But in the end, they'd reminded him of something he couldn't ignore. The Northern Territories were watching for weakness, waiting for any excuse to challenge his rule. A blind heir would be seen as divine judgment. War would follow. So he'd chosen his throne over his son. Your Majesty. Thorne's voice cut through his thoughts. The captain stood in the doorway, his face grim. Behind him, 3 blood trackers waited, their red eyes gleaming in the darkness. Report, Melvin said, his voice flat. The lead tracker stepped forward, a female vampire with silver hair bound in warrior braids. We followed the prince's scent from the graveyard to the eastern quarter, Your Majesty. He's alive. Something in Melvin's chest loosened, though he kept his expression stone. Where? A human cottage. Single occupant. The woman who? She paused, choosing her words carefully. The woman who removed him from the ritual site. The loosening in Melvin's chest froze into something sharp and cold. A human. A human had dared to interfere with vampire sacred law. Had stolen his son, stolen the heir to the throne, and carried him off like common property. She took him, Melvin said softly, and his voice carried the promise of death. A human woman walked into a consecrated ritual and stole the vampire king's son. Yes, Your Majesty. The rage came then, ice-cold and absolute. Not the hot fury of battle, but the calculated wrath of 5 centuries of rule. This wasn't just theft. It was treason. Sacrilege. An insult to everything his kingdom was built upon. Her name, he demanded. Katie Harrow. Widow. 58. She lives alone, survives on herb selling, and I don't care about her life story. Melvin stood, his shadow stretching across the floor like something alive. Assemble my personal guard. We leave at sunset tomorrow. What are your orders regarding the woman, sire? Melvin's eyes burned crimson in the darkness, his fangs extending as fury coursed through his ancient blood. A human had dared to touch his son. Had dared to steal from him. Had dared to interfere with traditions that predated her entire pathetic mortal lineage. She'll beg for death before I grant it, he said quietly. Ready the execution square. I want the entire kingdom to witness what happens to those who defy our sacred laws. Captain Thorne bowed and retreated, the blood trackers melting into shadow behind him. Melvin stood alone in his chamber, his fists clenched at his sides, his dead wife's final words echoing in the silence. Promise me you'll love him. He'd promised. And he'd broken that promise the moment he'd laid Sean in the graveyard. Now a human woman would die for his cowardice, and his son would learn that mercy was a luxury kings couldn't afford. The thought tasted like poison. But poison, he reminded himself, was something he'd learned to swallow long ago. Chapter 4. The door exploded inward at midnight, torn from its hinges like paper. Melvin stood in the doorway, his armor black as obsidian, his eyes burning crimson in the darkness. Power radiated from him in waves, 5 centuries of violence and rule compressed into a single moment of fury. Behind him, the night itself seemed to recoil. Katie had 1 second to register his presence before he was across the room, moving faster than human eyes could track. His hand closed around her throat, lifting her off her feet, his fangs fully extended and his voice a growl that shook the rafters. You dare. Papa. The small voice cut through Melvin's rage like a blade through silk. Sean sat by the hearth, his small hands hovering over neat piles of dried herbs arranged on the table before him. Rosemary, sage, lavender, thyme, each separated by scent and texture. His blind eyes turned toward the door with uncanny accuracy, tracking his father's voice. Quick pause. If this story has you hooked, tap subscribe and drop a like. Then tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what moment grabbed you the most. Your comments help keep the story alive. Melvin's hand froze, his grip on Katie's throat loosening but not releasing. He stared at his son, his mind struggling to reconcile the image before him with what he'd expected to find. Sean wasn't cowering, wasn't starving or abused or broken. The boy's face was clean, his hair brushed, and he wore a simple cotton shirt that, while patched and too large, was warm and whole. A half-eaten bowl of stew sat beside him, still steaming. Papa, you came back, Sean said, and his voice carried something Melvin hadn't heard in years. Hope. The kind lady said you would. She said you probably had important king things to do, but that you'd come when you could. Melvin's fingers spasmed. Katie made a choked sound, her weathered hands clawing at his wrist. He released her and she collapsed, gasping, against the wall. This is sage, Sean continued, his small fingers moving to another pile, oblivious to the violence hanging in the air. It smells like the gardens after rain. And this one, he touched the next pile, is lavender. It's purple, which Katie says feels like cool shadows and sounds like evening bells. Melvin took a step forward, his boots crunching on the broken door. His prepared violence, his cold fury, his righteous condemnation, all of it crumbled as he watched his son sort herbs with the careful precision of a scholar. What have you done? He whispered, but he wasn't sure if he was asking Katie or himself. Katie pushed herself upright, one hand pressed to her bruised throat, her eyes blazing with defiance despite her trembling. I taught him, she rasped. What you should have done 6 years ago. Melvin's head snapped toward her, fangs bared. You know nothing of. I know you left him to die in a graveyard. Katie cut him off, her voice gaining strength. I know you abandoned a 6-year-old child among corpses because he couldn't see. I know he spent 3 days in that castle believing he was cursed and useless and unwanted. The council demanded. The council isn't his father. The words hung in the air between them. Melvin stared at this frail human woman who should be begging for her life, who should be cowering before him, and instead stood straight-backed and furious, positioned between him and his son like she had any right. Papa. Sean's voice wavered now, uncertainty creeping in. Why does the kind lady sound scared? Did I do something wrong? Melvin's eyes closed. When they opened, some of the crimson had faded, leaving only the deep gold of his natural color. He looked at his son, truly looked, and saw what he'd been too afraid to see before. Shawn sat tall despite his fear, his hands still resting on the herbs he'd sorted, his blind face turned toward his father with desperate hope. The boy had arranged the plants in perfect rows, had memorized their properties by scent alone, had learned in 3 days what most sighted children took months to master. "No," Melvin said, his voice rough. "You did nothing wrong." He crossed the room slowly, deliberately, giving Shawn time to hear his approach. He knelt before his son, the Vampire King knelt, and for the first time in 6 years, he really saw the child his wife had died to give him. "Shawn," he whispered. "I'm sorry." Shawn's small hands reached out, finding his father's face with trembling fingers. They traced the sharp angles of his cheeks, the hard line of his jaw, the wetness that shouldn't have been there. "You're crying," Shawn whispered in wonder. "Kings don't cry. This one does." Behind them, Katie Harrow slid down the wall, her hand still pressed to her bruised throat, and watched a king remember how to be a father. Outside, the vampire guard waited for orders that would not come. Chapter 5. The silence stretched until Katie could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Melvin still knelt before Shawn, the boy's small hands resting on his father's face, both of them frozen in a moment that felt too fragile to breathe through. Then Melvin stood, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Captain Thorne," he called, his voice carrying through the shattered doorway. "Stand down. Return to the castle." "Your Majesty?" The guard captain's confusion was palpable. "The woman." "I said stand down." Footsteps retreated into the night. Melvin turned to face Katie, and though the murderous rage had left his eyes, something harder remained. The cold calculation of a king weighing scales of justice. "You interfered with a sacred ritual," he said quietly. "Touched a royal vampire without permission. Stole the heir to my throne. Any one of these crimes carries a death sentence." Katie pushed herself upright, her legs shaking, but her spine straight. Her throat throbbed where his fingers had nearly crushed her windpipe, but she met his golden eyes without flinching. "Then kill me," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "Add me to the count." Melvin's eyes narrowed. "The count? Of humans your kind has murdered." Katie's weathered hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I had a son once. Thomas. He was 12 years old when your soldiers came through our village collecting tribute. That's what you called it. Tribute. As if taking children was some holy tax we owed for the privilege of existing in your kingdom." Shawn's head turned toward her voice, his small body tensing. "They took 20 children that day," Katie continued, her voice cracking. 20. Told us it was necessary for the kingdom's prosperity. That vampire magic required young blood for the protection spells on the castle walls. We never saw any of them again." Melvin stood perfectly still, but something flickered across his face. "That practice was outlawed 70 years ago. It was outlawed 70 years ago because you needed human labor more than you needed blood sacrifices." Katie's laugh was bitter and broken. "Not because it was wrong. Not because children screamed when they were dragged from their mother's arms. Because economics changed. I didn't." "You didn't personally kill my son?" "No. But you rule the kingdom that did. You sit on a throne built from bones and tell yourself it's tradition." Katie took a step forward, and impossibly, Melvin took a step back. "So yes, your Majesty. Kill me. Execute me for the crime of wrapping a freezing child in my shawl. But you'll be killing the only person who's ever made your boy smile. The only person who's taught him he is worth. Is that the legacy you want? Is that what you'll tell yourself when you return him to that castle where everyone looks through him like he's already a ghost?" Melvin's jaw clenched, his fangs pressing into his lower lip hard enough to draw blood. "You know nothing of what I want. I know you left him in a graveyard to die. Because the council demanded it. Because a blind heir would be seen as weakness, and weakness means war, and war means thousands dead, human and vampire alike. I made an impossible choice. You made a coward's choice, Katie said softly, and the words hit harder than any shout could have. Melvin moved so fast she didn't see it. One moment he was across the room, the next his hand was around her throat again, lifting her off the ground. His eyes blazed crimson, his voice a growl of barely contained violence. You dare. Papa, stop. Sean's cry cut through the rage. Please don't hurt her. Please. Melvin's hand trembled. He looked at Katie's face, at her weathered features contorted with pain, but still defiant, still unafraid, and slowly lowered her to the ground. His hand fell away. What have you taught him? The question came out rough, almost desperate. In 3 days, what have you taught my son? Katie coughed, pressing a hand to her abused throat. How to live. How to navigate space through sound and touch. How to read the world through senses sharper than sight. Show me. Katie hesitated, then moved to the window. She opened it, and the night sounds of the forest flooded in. Crickets chirping, branches creaking, and somewhere distant, the call of a night bird. Sean, she said gently. What do you hear? The boy's head tilted, his blind eyes closing in concentration. Owl, he said immediately. Barn owl. Female. Hunting the eastern field. Another call echoed through the darkness. Nightjar. Male. Looking for a mate. Another. Whippoorwill. Agitated. Something disturbed its nest. Sean continued, identifying 6 different species by their calls alone, describing their locations, their moods, their purposes. He spoke with confidence and precision, his small face animated with the joy of demonstrating knowledge he'd worked hard to acquire. Melvin stared at his son, his expression shifting through shock, wonder, and something that might have been grief. How? I listened, Sean said simply. Katie taught me that not seeing doesn't mean not knowing. It just means knowing differently. The Vampire King sank into Katie's rickety chair, his armor suddenly seeming too heavy, too much. He looked at this frail human woman who'd shown his son more care in 3 days than an entire court had in 6 years. I should execute you, he whispered. Yes, Katie agreed. You should. But I won't. No, Katie said, her voice gentling. I don't think you will. Outside, a whippoorwill called again, and Sean turned toward the sound with perfect accuracy, his face shining with knowledge his father was only beginning to understand. Quick pause. If this story has you hooked, tap subscribe and drop a like. Then tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what moment grabbed you the most. Your comments help keep the story alive. Chapter 6. Dawn came too quickly. Melvin had stayed through the night, watching Sean sleep in Katie's narrow bed, the boy's small chest rising and falling with peaceful breaths he'd never shown in the castle. The king sat in the corner like a sentinel, his armor still on, his mind churning through decisions that could reshape or destroy his kingdom. Katie dozed in her chair by the hearth, exhaustion finally claiming her. Every few minutes, she'd jerk awake, her hand flying to her bruised throat, her eyes finding Sean to ensure he was still breathing. The sun had just begun painting the horizon gold when the air outside shifted. Melvin was on his feet before the first footstep sounded. He moved to the doorway, his body blocking the entrance, his hand instinctively reaching for the sword he hadn't drawn in decades. They materialized from the morning mist like wraiths given form. 9 figures in crimson robes, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods. Behind them, a dozen vampire guards in ceremonial armor, their expressions carefully blank. And at their center, High Priestess Morena. She was ancient, older than Melvin by centuries, her power pressing against the air like a physical weight. When she pulled back her hood, her face was a mask of preserved beauty wrapped around something dead and cold. Her eyes glowed with the pale silver of old magic. Your Majesty, she said, her voice like silk over razors. How convenient. We were about to send trackers to find you. Melvin didn't move from the doorway. The council convenes at the palace, priestess. You have no authority here. No authority? Morena's laugh was brittle glass shattering. We have the authority of 5,000 years of tradition. The authority of sacred law. The authority you yourself invoked when you agreed to the ritual 3 nights ago. Behind Melvin, Katie stood, moving quietly to place herself between the doorway and the bed where Sean still slept. Morana's silver eyes tracked the movement. The thief. How fitting that she cowers behind her king. I'm not cowering, Katie said, her voice steady despite her trembling. I'm protecting a child. You're harboring a defective heir who should have returned to the earth as the gods demanded. Morana's gaze shifted back to Melvin. Step aside, Your Majesty. This human has violated sacred law. She and the boy must face judgment. The boy, Melvin said quietly, is my son. The boy is an abomination. A blind vampire is a cursed vampire. Every day he lives, he weakens the bloodline. Every breath he takes is an insult to our ancestors. Morana took a step forward, and the council moved with her, a wall of crimson and ancient power. The ritual was clear. You agreed to it. You participated. You cannot undo what was ordained. I can do whatever I want. I'm the king. You're the king because we made you king. Morana's voice dropped, becoming something darker, more dangerous. Have you forgotten, Melvin? When your brother challenged your claim to the throne, who provided the votes you needed in council? Who performed the blood rites that bound the noble houses to your rule? You sit on that throne because we put you there. And what we give, we can take away. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Behind Melvin, Sean stirred, waking to the sound of raised voices. Papa. The small voice was frightened, confused. Morana's eyes gleamed. Still calls you Papa. How touching. This human has poisoned the bloodline with hope. Made the defective heir believe he is worth. Do you see the danger, Your Majesty? Hope is a disease among those who should accept their fate. His fate, Katie said, stepping forward despite Melvin's warning growl, is to be brilliant. To hear things you can't hear. To know things you're too blind to see. In 3 days, he's learned more than 6 years in your precious court taught him. That's not a curse. That's a gift. Silence, human filth. No. Melvin's voice cut through the priestess's rage like a blade. You will not speak to her that way. The council went still. Morana's silver eyes widened fractionally. Your Majesty, she said carefully. You cannot possibly be defending this criminal. Melvin looked at the 9 council members who'd helped him secure his throne. Looked at Morana, who'd performed his coronation rites. Looked at the guards who'd served him faithfully for decades. Then he turned and looked at his son, sitting up in the narrow bed, his blind eyes searching for his father's voice. At Katie, standing between the boy and danger with nothing but a bruised throat and unshakable courage. I defended the wrong people for too long, Melvin said softly. I let you convince me that tradition was more important than mercy. That power required cruelty. That my son was disposable because he couldn't see. Your Majesty, I was wrong. The words fell into the dawn like stones into still water, their ripples spreading outward. The council members shifted, glancing at each other. The guards' hands moved to their sword hilts. Morana's face went deadly calm. You're choosing them. Over us. Over the throne we gave you. I'm choosing my son, Melvin said. Over everything. Then you've chosen war. Morana's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than any shout. By sunset, the noble houses will hear of this. By tomorrow, they'll be choosing sides. You've just fractured this kingdom, Melvin. For a blind child and a human woman who means nothing. They mean everything, Melvin said quietly. And if the kingdom fractures because I refuse to murder a 6-year-old boy, then perhaps it deserves to break. Morana stared at him for a long moment, her ancient face unreadable. Then she pulled her hood back up, becoming shadow once more. So be it, she hissed. But when the noble houses come for your throne, and they will come, don't expect mercy from those who remember what you've forgotten. Tradition is all that separates us from chaos. She turned, the council flowing behind her like crimson water, and disappeared into the morning mist. Melvin stood in the doorway until they were gone. Then his shoulders sagged, the weight of what he'd just done settling onto him like chains. "Papa?" Sean's voice was small, frightened. "Did you just make those people very angry?" Melvin crossed to the bed and knelt beside his son. "Yes." "Because of me?" "No." Melvin took Sean's small hands in his own. "Because of me. Because I finally did what I should have done 6 years ago." Katie's voice came from behind them, rough with emotion. "What happens now?" Melvin looked at her over his shoulder, this human woman who'd risked everything for a child that wasn't hers. "Now," he said quietly, "we prepare for war." Chapter 7. The throne room had never felt so suffocating. Torches cast dancing shadows across ancient stone as the Council of Elders formed a semicircle around the dais, their faces carved from centuries of cruelty. High Priestess Morena stood at the center, her skeletal fingers wrapped around a staff topped with a bleached crow's skull. Behind her, King Melvin sat rigid on his throne, jaw clenched so tight Katie could see the muscle jumping beneath his pale skin. Sean stood small and fragile in the vast space, his milky eyes fixed on nothing, his thin shoulders trembling beneath the oversized royal tunic someone had dressed him in. Katie knelt beside him, one weathered hand resting lightly on his back, feeling each terrified breath. "The child will prove his worth," Morena announced, her voice echoing off vaulted ceilings, "or the old laws will be satisfied before moonrise." She snapped her fingers, and 3 identical vampires stepped forward from the crowd, triplets, their faces mirror images of aristocratic disdain. "Tell us, blind princeling, which one insulted your father during yesterday's council meeting?" Katie felt Sean's panic spike, his small body going rigid. She leaned close, her lips barely moving. "Listen to their feet, sweetheart. Remember what I taught you." Sean tilted his head, and the throne room fell into breathless silence. The triplets shifted, leather boots scraping stone. One set of footsteps dragged slightly, favoring a left leg. "The one on the right," Sean said quietly. "He walks like someone who sits too long. Advisors who talk too much forget to stretch." A murmur rippled through the assembled vampires. Morena's eyes narrowed. Coincidence? She gestured again, and a vampire lord read a dense legal passage about border treaties and blood tithes, complex, winding sentences designed to confuse. "Repeat it." Katie squeezed Sean's shoulder once. His voice, though shaking, recited every word perfectly, even correcting a deliberate error the Lord had inserted. Quick pause. If this story has you hooked, tap subscribe and drop a like. Then tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what moment grabbed you the most. Your comments help keep the story alive. "The boy has a good memory," Morena conceded, ice dripping from each syllable. "But parlor tricks do not make a king." She moved closer, her ancient face contorting with contempt. "A king must see his enemies." "Tell me, child, how will you know when someone approaches with a blade? How will you read the treachery in their eyes when you have no eyes that can see?" Sean's hand found Katie's, gripping tight. For a terrible moment, Katie thought he would break, would crumble beneath the weight of centuries-old hatred. But then the boy straightened, his chin lifting with a dignity that silenced even Morena. "I'll know," Sean whispered, "because I can hear your heart, priestess. It beats faster when you lie. And right now, it's racing." The throne room erupted. Chapter 8. The silence after Sean's words lasted only a heartbeat before Morena's fury shattered it. Her skeletal hand shot toward Katie with inhuman speed, grasping the widow by her throat and hauling her upward as if she weighed nothing. Katie's feet dangled above the marble floor, her fingers clawing uselessly at the iron grip cutting off her air. "Enough of this mockery," Morena hissed, her eyes burning with an ancient rage that had seen kingdoms rise and fall. "The boy has been corrupted by human sentimentality. The woman has poisoned the royal bloodline with her weakness." From within her robes, she drew a ceremonial blade, its edge black as a moonless night, its handle carved from bone yellowed with age. "The old laws are clear. Death for those who defile the sacred rituals. death for those who dare touch what belongs to the darkness." Sean cried out, stumbling forward, his hands grasping at empty air. "No, please don't hurt her." Katie's vision began to blur at the edges, dark spots blooming like nightshade as her lungs screamed for air. Through the haze, she saw the blade rise, saw torchlight gleaming along its cruel edge. Somewhere distant, she heard Sean sobbing, and she thought of her own son, lost to this same merciless world, and wondered if he'd cried for her too. The blade began its descent. And froze. King Melvin's hand had materialized around Morana's wrist, his grip unbreakable as stone. The High Priestess turned, shock cracking through her ancient composure. The entire court seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a moment that would reshape everything. "Release her," Melvin commanded, his voice low and deadly calm. "Your Majesty, the laws." "I said release her." The words dropped like guillotine blades, each syllable edged with an authority that had ruled for 3 centuries. Morana's fingers opened involuntarily, and Katie collapsed to the floor, gasping and coughing, her throat already bruising. Melvin stepped down from his throne, his crimson cloak trailing behind him like spilled blood. When he spoke again, his voice carried to every corner of the vast chamber, resonating through marble and bone until the very pillars seemed to tremble. "I have been blind while my son could see. I have been deaf while he learned to hear the truth beneath every word. I have been weak while he showed me what true strength requires." The Council of Elders shifted uneasily, exchanging glances weighted with centuries of conspiracy. Lord Corvus, the eldest after Morana, stepped forward. "My king, you cannot mean to." "This woman," Melvin continued, pointing to Katie where she knelt on the cold floor, Sean now pressed against her side, "showed me that strength wears many faces. She risked everything when she had nothing to give. She saw worth where I saw only shame. She protected my son when I abandoned him to darkness and death." Morana's face contorted with barely contained fury. "You would overturn 1,000 years of tradition for one human and one defective child? The kingdom will view you as. The kingdom will view me as a father who finally opened his eyes." Melvin's hands moved to his crown, the ancient circlet of silver and black diamonds that had adorned vampire kings since before human memory. He lifted it from his head, and the gasps that echoed through the throne room sounded like a wind through a graveyard. He walked to Sean, each footstep deliberate, measured. Then, before his son, before his court, before the shocked and scandalized Council of Elders, King Melvin of the Night Realm lowered himself to his knees. He placed his crown on the marble floor between them, the metallic sound ringing out like a bell tolling the death of the old world. "My son," he said, and his voice cracked, the first time in 300 years that anyone had heard the king's voice break. "Forgive me. I left you in the cold because I was too much a coward to face my own grief. Your mother died bringing you into this world, and I blamed you for the light that went out of my existence. But you're not the darkness. I am." Sean's milky eyes welled with tears that spilled down his pale cheeks. His small hand reached out, trembling, until it found his father's face. "Papa," he whispered. The throne room erupted into chaos. Half the court surged forward in outrage while the other half stood frozen in disbelief. Morana's screech of fury rose above it all. "This is treason against the old ways. The council will not stand for." "Then the council can fall," Melvin roared, rising to his feet with Sean cradled against his chest, the boy's face buried in his father's shoulder. His eyes blazed crimson as he faced down the elders who had guided his reign. "I am done sacrificing my heart on the altar of your ancient hatreds. My son lives. This woman lives. And anyone who challenges that will answer to me." In the trembling silence that followed, Katie struggled to her feet, her hand pressed to her bruised throat, and met the king's eyes. She saw fear there and fury, and something else, something that looked remarkably like hope. Quick pause. If this story has you hooked, tap subscribe and drop a like. Then tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what moment grabbed you the most. Your comments help keep the story alive. The old world was ending. Whether the new one would be better remained to be seen. But for the first time in centuries, the Vampire King was no longer blind. Chapter 9. The throne room had changed in 6 months, though not in ways the eye could easily see. The same ancient tapestries still hung from stone walls. The same torches still cast their dancing shadows across marble floors. But there was something different in the air now, something that hummed beneath the surface of every court session like a new heartbeat for an old kingdom. Sean sat in a chair carved from dark wood and upholstered in midnight velvet, positioned to the right of his father's throne. The circlet resting on his white blonde hair was simpler than the king's crown, silver woven with moonstone, but it caught the torchlight and held it, a quiet statement of belonging. His posture had changed too. Where once he had hunched and trembled, now he sat with the careful dignity of someone who had learned his own worth. The merchant claims the debt was paid in full. A vampire lord was arguing before the throne, his voice smooth as oil. The human must be mistaken about the remaining sum. King Melvin leaned back, his expression unreadable. "My son, what say you?" Sean tilted his head, and the court fell silent as it always did now during these moments. His milky eyes fixed on nothing, but everyone had learned that he saw more than most. Lord Tesseron's breathing changed when he said, "Paid in full," Sean said quietly. "His heart is racing." The human's voice stays steady. He paused, his small fingers tracing patterns on the arm of his chair. "Also, Lord Tesseron, you're wearing the same boots you wore 3 weeks ago when you claimed poverty before this court. But now they've been freshly oiled. Expensive oil. The kind that costs exactly 40 gold pieces, the same amount the human says you still owe him." The merchant's face drained of what little color it held. Melvin's lips curved into something that might have been a smile. "The debt will be paid by sunset, Lord Tesseron. With interest for wasting our time." As the merchant slunk away and the next petitioner approached, Sean felt his father's hand rest briefly on his shoulder, a touch that still made his throat tight with emotion, even after 6 months of such gestures. Quick pause. If this story has you hooked, tap subscribe and drop a like. Then tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what moment grabbed you the most. Your comments help keep the story alive. Beyond the throne room, in the eastern wing of the palace that had once housed forgotten storage chambers, Katie Harrow walked through rooms transformed into something the kingdom had never seen. Children, human and vampire, blind and deaf, those who limped and those who wheezed, those missing limbs and those whose minds worked differently, bent over workbenches and looms, their faces tight with concentration. A vampire girl born without hands wove baskets with her feet, her work more intricate than anything the able-bodied could manage. A human boy who couldn't speak carved letters into wood blocks, creating the kingdom's first books designed to be felt rather than read. Katie paused beside a young vampire whose twisted legs meant he would never walk, watching as he mixed medicines with a precision that would shame most healers. "Excellent work, Thomas," she said, her voice still rough from where Morana's fingers had crushed her windpipe. The High Priestess had fled the kingdom the night of Melvin's declaration, and no one had seen her since. "Dr. Grim Ward says your tincture for fever is the finest he's tested." The boy beamed, and Katie felt the familiar warmth spread through her chest. This was worth it. All of it. The nightmares she still had of that blade descending, the suspicious stares from traditionalist vampires in the market, the exhaustion that came from building something entirely new from the ruins of ancient cruelty, it was all worth it for moments like these. That evening, as the last petitioner departed and the throne room emptied, Melvin gestured to a servant who carried in something covered with black silk. "I have something for you, Sean." The silk whisked away, revealing a table bearing what looked like a landscape carved in miniature. Mountains rose in ridges of wood and stone, valleys dipped in smooth grooves, rivers traced in polished metal that felt cool under fingertips. Cities were marked with different textured materials, rough granite for the mining towns, smooth marble for the coastal cities, warm wood for the farming villages. Sean's hands moved across it with reverent slowness, his fingers learning every hill and hollow. His expression shifted from curiosity to wonder to something approaching awe. The map showed everything: the forests where Katie had once gathered herbs, the graveyard where she'd found him, the palace where they now stood. His kingdom. His home. The world he would someday help his father shepherd into something better than it had been. "I can see it, Papa," Sean whispered, his voice breaking with emotion as his fingertips traced the raised outline of the palace walls. "I can see everything." Melvin knelt beside his son's chair, and Katie, entering with her daily report, stopped in the doorway to watch. Father and son bent over the map together, one guiding the other's hands across mountains and rivers, teaching and learning in equal measure. Outside, night was falling across the kingdom. But for the first time in 1,000 years, the darkness didn't feel quite so absolute. Somewhere in the East Wing, a child who had been told she was worthless laughed as she mastered a new skill. Somewhere in the throne room, a king learned what it meant to be a father. And somewhere in between, an old widow smiled, her bruised throat aching, her weathered heart full. The old world had ended in chaos. But the new one, fragile and uncertain as it was, had been born in love.